The hangar should have been humming with life by 800 hours. Instead, Lieutenant Rachel Martinez walked through a graveyard of silent aircraft, her boots echoing against concrete that felt too cold for a Tuesday morning in Nevada. The clipboard, in her weathered hands, held the same mundane inventory sheets she'd been filling out for 3 years, ever since Commander Bradley Harrison decided she was better suited for Lieutenant Martinez, Dr. Foster said, grasping Rachel's hand firmly. "I don't know how to thank you. When we saw that landslide coming down, we thought we were going to die in those mountains." "Just doing my job, ma'am," Rachel replied, but her voice carried a satisfaction that hadn't been there in 3 years. As the ambulances departed for the base hospital, Rachel found herself surrounded by people who'd watched her mission from the ground. The crowd was larger than she'd realized. It seemed like half the base had turned out to witness the return of the forgotten aircraft and its grounded pilot. Commander Harrison approached through the crowd, his expression unreadable. Rachel braced herself for whatever was coming, debriefing, questions, or possibly disciplinary action for the unauthorized modifications she'd made to the F-14. "Lieutenant Martinez," Harrison said formally, stopping directly in front of her. Rachel snapped to attention. "Sir!" "Outstanding mission execution," Harrison continued, and she could hear genuine respect in his voice. "That was some of the finest flying I've witnessed in 20 years of service." The words hit Rachel harder than she'd expected. For 3 years, she'd wondered if she'd lost her edge, if the grounding had been justified, if she really was better suited for inventory management than flight operations. "Thank you, sir," she managed. Harrison looked past her at the F-14, still steaming from the heat of its engines. "I owe you an apology, Martinez. 3 years ago you submitted a report about our overdependence on digital systems. I dismissed it as insubordination. Today proved that you were right." The admission sent a ripple through the crowd of personnel listening to the conversation. Rachel saw Captain Thompson's expression change, watched Major Stevens nod slowly, noticed the way Sergeant Brooks was trying not to smile. "Sir, Rachel began. "No," Harrison interrupted. "Let me finish. For 3 years, you've been maintaining that aircraft in perfect condition, without being asked, without recognition, without complaint. You kept your skills sharp, your knowledge current, and your professionalism intact despite being sidelined. By my decision." Rachel remained at attention, but she could feel something shifting inside her chest. The weight she'd been carrying for 3 years was beginning to lift. "Which brings me to the real reason I'm here," Harrison continued. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to active flight status. You'll be leading a new program evaluating backup systems and analog flight capabilities." The folder contained orders that made it official. She was a pilot again. But more than that, she was being asked to teach others the lessons she'd learned the hard way. "Furthermore," Harrison added, "I'm recommending you for promotion to captain and submitting your actions today for commendation. The Air Force needs more officers who understand that technology serves the mission, not the other way around." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Rachel saw faces she'd worked alongside for 3 years, people who'd watched her do inventory and maintain equipment without realizing she was preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Captain Thompson pushed through the crowd and extended his hand. "Martinez, I owe you an apology too. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about that aircraft." Rachel shook his hand, surprised by the genuine remorse in his expression. "We all learned something today, sir." "Yeah," Thompson replied with a rueful smile. "We learned that the best pilot on the base was doing inventory while we were playing with computers." As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel found herself alone. With the F-14 for a moment, she walked around the aircraft slowly, noting the dust from the mountain landing, the scorch marks from the engines, the small signs of an aircraft that had been pushed to its limits and performed flawlessly. Sergeant Brooks appeared beside her. "Hell of a thing, Lieutenant, or should I say Captain?" "Let's stick with Rachel for now," she replied. "And thank you, Kevin. I couldn't have done this without your help." Brooks shrugged. "I just provided parts and kept my mouth shut." "You did," Everything else. Rachel looked back at the hangar where she'd spent 3 years walking inventory routes and checking equipment that everyone else had forgotten. You know what the funny thing is? What's that? I'm not angry anymore. For 3 years I was frustrated about being grounded, about not being trusted with important missions. But today proved that I was exactly where I needed to be, learning exactly what I needed to learn. Brooks nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the detour is the real destination. As the sun set over Nellis Air Force Base, Rachel Martinez stood beside the F-14 Tomcat that had carried her back to the sky. Tomorrow she'd begin training other pilots on analog systems and backup procedures. She'd help the Air Force prepare for the next time their technology failed, and they needed someone who understood that the most advanced system was often the simplest one. But tonight she was just a pilot who'd remembered what it felt like to fly, and sometimes that was everything. The emergency lasted 18 hours. By morning, the base looked like a technology graveyard. Every computer system, every digital interface, every satellite connection, all of it fried by what the tech crews were calling a cascading electromagnetic pulse event. The official story was equipment malfunction. The whispered rumors spoke of something far more serious. Rachel walked through the hangar, past clusters of frustrated maintenance crews staring at blank screens and dead control panels. The newest jets, the pride of the Air Force's technological superiority, sat as useful as expensive sculptures. Pilots who'd never flown anything without computer assistance now faced the reality that their sophisticated aircraft were completely dependent on systems that no longer existed. "How long until we get backup power?" asked Lieutenant Jessica Parker, one of the younger pilots. She stood beside her F-35, running her hands over the dark cockpit displays like she was trying to wake them up through sheer willpower. "Could be days," replied Master Sergeant Robert King, the chief maintenance officer. "Maybe weeks. The pulse didn't just kill our local systems. It took out the entire grid infrastructure. We're talking about rebuilding from scratch." Rachel listened to the conversation while continuing her inventory rounds. She'd been doing the same job for 3 years, but today felt different. Today she was the only person in the hangar who didn't seem surprised or panicked by the situation. While others frantically tried to restore their digital dependencies, she methodically checked manual systems, mechanical backups, and analog equipment that most people had forgotten existed. Near the communications station, she overheard Commander Harrison on a satellite phone, one of the few pieces of equipment still functioning. "No, sir, we have no operational aircraft," he was saying. "Everything depends on computer systems we can't restore." "Yes, sir, I understand the timeline. We're working on alternatives." The conversation continued, but Rachel had heard enough. She knew what timeline meant. Somewhere, people were in danger, and the base's multi-million-dollar aircraft were as useless as paperweights. She made her way to the forgotten corner where the F-14 sat. Unlike everything else in the hangar, the old Tomcat looked exactly the same. No dead screens, no failed systems, no frustrated technicians, just an aircraft waiting for someone who knew how to fly it. "Martinez," she turned to find Sergeant Kevin Brooks approaching. He was one of the few maintenance crew members who'd been around long enough to remember when she'd been a pilot. More importantly, he was one of the few who'd actually read her report about the system vulnerabilities 3 years ago. "Crazy situation," he said, nodding toward the chaos around them. "Not that crazy," Rachel replied. "This is exactly the kind of scenario we should have been preparing for." Brooks studied her face carefully. "You mean the report you filed? The one about the computer dependencies?" "Among other things." Rachel's voice was neutral, but her eyes held something that made Brooks pay closer attention. "You know," he said, slowly. "I was thinking about that old bird." He gestured toward the F-14. "Been wondering if she'd still run if someone knew the right buttons to push." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She looked at the Tomcat, then at the chaos surrounding them, then back at Brooks. Hypothetically, she'd need a complete systems check, manual fuel flow calibration, hydraulic pressure verification, and someone would need to bypass the electronic starter system. Rachel's voice was clinical, but there was something else underneath. Of course, that's all theoretical. Nobody's certified to work on these old birds anymore. Brooks smiled grimly. Nobody except the people who used to fly them. Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices near the command station. Commander Harrison was arguing with someone on the satellite phone, his face growing redder with each exchange. Sir, with respect, we cannot commit to that timeline without operational aircraft. I understand the consequences, but I cannot authorize a mission with no way to complete it. Rachel caught fragments of the conversation. Medical emergency. Remote location. Time sensitive. No alternatives. She looked back at the F-14, sitting patiently in its corner like a loyal dog waiting for its master to return. 3 years ago, she'd been grounded for questioning the military's over-reliance on technology. Today, that same over-reliance had left an entire airbase helpless, but not completely helpless. "Brooks," she said quietly, "how long would it take to run a complete diagnostic on that aircraft, hypothetically?" The sergeant's eyes lit up with understanding. For someone who knew what they were looking for, maybe 4 hours. "But we'd need authorization to put it back in service," Rachel interrupted. "But there's nothing stopping us from making sure it's properly maintained. After all, it's still on the inventory list." As if summoned. By their conversation, Captain Thompson appeared beside them. "What are you two conspiring about over here?" "Just discussing proper maintenance protocols," Rachel replied smoothly, "making sure all our assets are properly cataloged." Thompson glanced at the F-14 with obvious disdain. "That old thing? It's not an asset, Martinez. It's a museum piece, a reminder of how far we've come." Rachel met his gaze steadily. Funny how perspectives change when the power goes out. The captain's expression hardened, but before he could respond, another alarm began blaring. This time it wasn't a drill or a technical malfunction. Through the hangar doors they could see vehicles racing toward the flight line, emergency lights flashing in the growing darkness. The timeline Commander Harrison had been discussing was accelerating, and as Rachel watched the chaos unfold around them, she realized that everyone's perspective was about to change dramatically. The forgotten jet in the corner was about to become the most important aircraft on the base. The briefing room felt like a funeral. Commander Harrison stood at the front, his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled from 18 hours of crisis management. Behind him, a large screen displayed a map with a red circle marked approximately 200 miles northeast of their position. "The situation is this," Harrison began, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "A research team studying seismic activity in the mountains has been caught in a landslide. 3 injured, 1 critical. The weather window for helicopter rescue closes in 6 hours, and after that, we're looking at a potential fatality." He clicked to the next slide showing weather data and terrain analysis. "The location is accessible only by air, and only with precision landing capabilities. Unfortunately, our entire fleet of operational aircraft remains grounded due to the electromagnetic pulse event." Rachel sat in the back row, technically present because all personnel had been required to attend, but invisible to the conversation happening around her. She watched as pilots and officers discussed options that didn't exist, backup plans that depended on systems that were still dead. "What about other bases?" asked Captain Thompson. "Surely someone has operational aircraft?" "Negative," Harrison replied. "The pulse event was regional but extensive. We're the closest operational base to the rescue site, and even our basic communications are limited to satellite phone." Major Patricia Stevens, the base's senior pilot, leaned forward. "Sir, what about manual flight systems? Are there any aircraft that don't depend on computer navigation?" Harrison's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "All our current aircraft require computer assistance for navigation, weapons systems, and basic flight operations. Without satellite GPS and digital interfaces, they're effectively grounded." The room fell silent. Rachel could feel the weight of frustration and professional helplessness settling over the assembled personnel. These were people trained to solve problems, to complete missions, to save lives. Now they sat powerless because their technology had failed them. "There is one possibility," said Sergeant Brooks from the side of the room. All eyes turned to him. Harrison's expression suggested he didn't appreciate unsolicited input from enlisted personnel. "Go ahead, Sergeant," Harrison said curtly. "The F-14 Tomcat in Hangar Bay 3. It's analog flight systems, mechanical navigation, no computer dependencies. If it's still airworthy, it could potentially complete the mission." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of people processing an uncomfortable possibility. Captain Thompson was the first to speak. "Sir, that aircraft has been decommissioned. For years. Even if it could fly, nobody here is qualified to pilot it." "Actually," Brooks continued, glancing briefly at Rachel, "Lieutenant Martinez is certified on the F-14 platform. She flew them during her initial training before transitioning to the F-35 program." Rachel felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Commander Harrison's gaze was particularly intense, and she could see him remembering their last conversation 3 years ago, the one where he'd told her that her old-fashioned approach to flying made her unsuitable for modern aircraft. "Martinez," Harrison said slowly, "how long since you've flown an F-14? 6 years, sir," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "But I maintained certification on analog systems throughout my training. The aircraft hasn't been operational in years," Major Stevens pointed out. "We don't even know if it's airworthy." "I've been maintaining it," Rachel said quietly. "As part of my inventory responsibilities, the aircraft is in better condition than the maintenance logs suggest." The room erupted in whispered conversations. Rachel caught fragments. "Completely untested. Kate, no backup systems. Career suicide." Harrison raised his hand for silence. When the room quieted, he studied Rachel with an expression she couldn't read. "Lieutenant, are you telling me you've been performing unauthorized maintenance on a decommissioned aircraft?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Rachel knew that her answer could end her military career permanently. She also knew that 3 people were going to die if nobody acted. "Sir, I've been ensuring that all aircraft on the base inventory remain properly maintained according to regulation. The F-14 is still on the inventory list." It was technically true, though everyone in the room knew she'd been going far beyond basic maintenance requirements. She'd been keeping that aircraft ready to fly because some part of her had always known this day would come. Harrison stared at her for a long moment. "Assuming the aircraft is airworthy, could you complete this mission?" Rachel met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir." "The landing site is rough terrain. No guidance systems, no ground control, no backup." "I understand, sir. If something goes wrong, there's no rescue mission coming for you. We have no other operational aircraft." Rachel's voice remained calm. "I understand the risks, sir." The room was completely silent now. Everyone present understood what was happening. The woman they'd dismissed, the pilot they'd grounded for being too traditional, was the only person who could save lives when all their advanced technology failed. Harrison looked around the room, seeing the faces of pilots who couldn't fly, and officers who couldn't act. Then he looked back at Rachel, sitting in the back row like she'd been sitting for 3 years, quiet, competent, and ready. "Very well," he said finally. "Martinez, you have a go for mission preparation. But I want that aircraft inspected by our best maintenance team before you so much as start the engines." As the briefing dissolved into rapid planning and coordination, Rachel remained seated for a moment longer. 3 years of inventory sheets and grease pencil nicknames had led to this moment. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even vindicated. She was just ready to fly. The F-14 Tomcat drew a crowd. Word had spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. The grounded pilot was going to attempt a rescue mission in the old bird that everyone had forgotten. By the time Rachel reached Hangar Bay 3, she found herself surrounded by maintenance crews, pilots, and officers who'd never paid attention to her before. Sergeant Brooks was already there, along with 2 other senior maintenance specialists. They moved around the aircraft with the systematic efficiency of people who understood that lives depended on their work. Rachel watched them carefully, noting their findings and comparing them to her own mental checklist. "Hydraulic systems are solid," reported Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Lee. "Whoever's been maintaining this bird knows what they're doing." Rachel caught Brooks's slight smile. He'd been quietly helping her for months, providing parts and technical support without asking questions. Now his gamble was paying off. "Flight control surfaces are responsive," added Senior Airman Maria Santos. "Control cables are in excellent condition, better than some of our newer aircraft, honestly." Commander Harrison appeared at Rachel's shoulder. "Martinez, walk me through your pre-flight process." For the next hour, Rachel demonstrated her knowledge of every system on the aircraft. She showed Harrison the manual fuel flow calibration she'd perfected, the hydraulic pressure adjustments she'd fine-tuned, and the engine startup sequence she'd memorized from the original technical manuals. "You've been preparing for this?" Harrison observed. It wasn't a question. "I've been doing my job, sir," Rachel replied, "making sure our equipment is ready when needed." Harrison studied her carefully. "Your job description doesn't include maintaining decommissioned aircraft. To operational standards." Rachel met his gaze without flinching. "My job description includes maintaining all aircraft on the base inventory. This aircraft is on the inventory." It was a carefully constructed defense, and they both knew it. Harrison could have written her up for insubordination or unauthorized maintenance. Instead, he nodded slowly. "What's your flight plan?" Rachel spread a paper map across the wing of the aircraft. Not a digital display, not a GPS readout, but an actual paper map with pencil, marks, and manual calculations. Direct route would be 47 minutes flight time, but weather patterns suggest wind shear through the mountain passes. I'm planning a slightly longer route that follows the valley systems. Total flight time approximately 55 minutes. Navigation? Dead reckoning and visual landmarks. I've studied the terrain features and identified backup landing sites in case of emergency. Rachel traced her finger along the route. The landing zone is rough, but within the aircraft's capabilities. The real challenge will be the medical evacuation. Major Stevens, who'd been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I need to ask directly. Do you believe you can complete this mission successfully?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Everyone present understood that this wasn't just about flying an aircraft. This was about proving that traditional skills, human judgment, and mechanical systems could succeed where advanced technology had failed. Rachel looked around at the faces watching her. 3 years ago, these same people had dismissed her concerns about over-reliance on technology. Now they were asking her to risk everything to compensate for that same over-reliance. "Major, I believe this aircraft and I can complete the mission," she said. "But I need everyone to understand something. If I don't come back, it won't be because the old systems failed. It'll be because the mission was inherently dangerous and someone had to try." The honesty of her response seemed to settle something in the room. Captain Thompson, who'd spent years mocking her old-fashioned approach, stepped forward. "Martinez, what do you need from us?" The question surprised her. Thompson had never asked for her opinion on anything. Now he was offering support. "I need the medical team to prepare a lightweight emergency kit. The F-14 has limited cargo space, but it can carry enough supplies to stabilize the injured until helicopter evacuation becomes possible. I also need someone to monitor weather conditions and provide updates via radio." "Done," Thompson replied immediately. As the preparation continued, Rachel noticed something unexpected happening. The maintenance crews weren't just checking systems. They were investing in the mission. Senior Airman Santos spent extra time calibrating the fuel system. Chief Lee personally inspected every hydraulic connection. Even mechanics who'd never worked on an F-14 were asking questions, learning systems, contributing their expertise. For the first time in 3 years, Rachel felt like part of a team again. "Martinez!" called a voice from the rear of the aircraft. She turned to find Flight Surgeon Major David Clark approaching with a medical kit. "I've assembled everything you'll need for emergency field treatment. It's designed to fit in the rear compartment without affecting aircraft balance." Rachel examined the kit carefully. "This is excellent work, sir. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Yet," Clark replied grimly. "Thank me when you bring those people home." The sun was setting as final preparations concluded. Rachel stood beside the F-14, watching the last of the daylight fade from the hangar. In a few hours, she'd be flying alone into mountains that had already claimed 3 lives, navigating by instruments that hadn't been considered state-of-the-art for 20 years. Commander Harrison approached one final time. "Martinez, I want you to know that if this mission succeeds, there will be consequences. Good ones. Your situation here will change." Rachel nodded. "And if it fails?" Harrison's expression was grim but honest. "If it fails, we'll all have to live with the knowledge that we waited too long to trust the right person with the right job." As the hangar lights dimmed for the night, Rachel remained beside her aircraft. Tomorrow morning, she would discover whether 3 years of patience, preparation, and quiet competence had been worth the wait. The F-14 Tomcat sat ready in the darkness, its analog instruments and mechanical systems waiting for a pilot who understood that sometimes the most advanced technology was the wisdom to know when simple solutions worked best. At 0400 hours, Rachel Martinez walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward Hangar Bay 3. The base was quieter than she'd ever heard it, but she could sense the tension in the air. Word of the rescue mission had spread through every corner of the facility, and she knew that dozens of eyes were watching from windows and doorways. The medical team had arrived early, loading the emergency supplies into the F-14's rear compartment. With careful precision, Dr. Clark personally verified each item, ensuring that everything was secured and balanced. The weight had to be perfect. Too heavy and the aircraft wouldn't perform properly, too light and they'd lack the supplies needed to save lives. "Last weather update," reported Lieutenant Parker, handing Rachel a printed summary. "Mountain. Winds are variable but manageable. Cloud ceiling is higher than forecast. You'll have good visibility for the approach." Rachel studied the data, cross-referencing it with her flight plan. The numbers looked acceptable, but she knew that mountain weather could change rapidly. She'd be flying on instinct as much as information. Sergeant Brooks appeared at her elbow. "Final systems check is complete. Everything's green. She's ready to fly." Rachel nodded, feeling the familiar pre-flight tension building in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd experienced before every combat mission, every training flight, every moment when she'd trusted her life to physics and machinery and her own judgment. Commander Harrison arrived with what looked like half the base's senior staff. The group gathered around the aircraft, creating an impromptu briefing session in the hangar. "Final mission parameters," Harrison announced. "Target location remains the same. Weather window is still open, but closing. You have approximately 4 hours to complete the rescue and return before conditions deteriorate." "Communication?" asked Rachel. "We'll maintain radio contact until you enter the mountain passes. After that, you'll be on your own until you clear the peaks on the return flight. The landing zone has emergency flares, but no ground control." Rachel absorbed this information without visible reaction. She'd expected to be flying alone, navigating by dead reckoning and visual landmarks. The lack of communication support was just another variable to manage. "Sir," she said formally, "request permission to begin engine startup sequence." Harrison looked around at the assembled group, then back at Rachel. "Permission granted. Bring them home, Lieutenant." The next few minutes blurred together in a sequence of familiar actions that Rachel's muscle memory had preserved perfectly. Pre-flight inspection, cockpit preparation, engine startup procedures that hadn't changed in 30 years. The F-14's twin engines roared to life with a sound that echoed through the hangar like controlled thunder. Rachel felt the aircraft's systems coming online, not through digital displays and computer interfaces, but through the subtle vibrations and responses that told her everything was functioning properly. The stick felt right in her hands. The rudder pedals responded correctly to her feet. The throttles moved smoothly through their range. This was what she'd been missing for 3 years, not just the act of flying, but the direct connection between pilot and machine that modern aircraft had sacrificed for technological sophistication. "Tower, this is Phoenix requesting taxi clearance," she said into her headset, using her old call sign without thinking. There was a pause before the response came. "Phoenix, this is Tower. Cleared for taxi to runway 09. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited." Good hunting. The controller's use of her call sign wasn't lost on her. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't Martinez or Inventory Queen. She was Phoenix again, rising from 3 years of ashes. The taxi to the runway felt like a victory parade. Ground crews lined the taxiway, watching the old Tomcat roll past with expressions of admiration and concern. These were people who understood aviation, who knew the difference between routine flights and missions that mattered. At the end of the runway, Rachel completed her final checks. Engine parameters were optimal. Control surfaces responded perfectly. Navigation instruments were aligned. The aircraft was ready. Tower, Phoenix ready for takeoff. Phoenix, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed. Rachel pushed the throttles forward, feeling the F-14's twin engines surge with power that pressed her back into the ejection seat. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with the eagerness of a machine that had been waiting 3 years to fly again. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick, and the Tomcat lifted off the concrete with the grace of an aircraft that had been designed for exactly this kind of mission. As the landing gear retracted and the runway fell away beneath her, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt free. The base disappeared behind her as she climbed toward the mountains. Ahead lay 200 miles of challenging terrain, uncertain weather, and 3 people whose lives depended on her ability to land an aircraft in conditions that would challenge even modern systems. But for the first time since she'd been grounded, Rachel Martinez wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. She was thinking about what she was about to prove, that sometimes the most reliable technology was a skilled pilot and a well-maintained aircraft. The sun was rising behind her as she flew toward the mountains, and Phoenix was finally flying home. The mountain terrain stretched below Rachel like a moonscape of granite and shadow. She flew the F-14 through passes that hadn't seen military aircraft in decades, navigating by landmarks her father had taught her to read when she was still learning to drive. Ridgelines, river valleys, and rock formations became her GPS coordinates. "Phoenix, Phoenix, do you copy?" The radio crackled with static and distant voices from the base. "Tower, this is Phoenix. I'm entering the target area now. Visibility is good, but I'm losing your signal strength." "Copy that, Phoenix. Weather remains stable. You're cleared for approach when ready." Rachel clicked off the radio, knowing it would be her last communication until she cleared the mountains on her return flight. From now on, she was truly alone. Just her, the aircraft, and the mission. The landing zone appeared ahead, exactly where the coordinates indicated. It was even worse than the briefing photos had suggested. A narrow strip of relatively flat ground surrounded by boulders, trees, and a steep drop-off on one side. Kind of landing that would test every hour of flight training she'd ever received. She could see the research team's camp below, partially buried under the landslide that had trapped them. Emergency flares had been arranged in a makeshift pattern, and she could make out 3 figures waving from beside a small shelter. One wasn't moving. Rachel began her approach, adjusting the F-14's speed and angle to compensate for the mountain winds that buffeted the aircraft from unpredictable directions. The Tomcat's analog instruments showed her everything she needed to know: airspeed, altitude, engine performance, without the lag time of computer processing. 50 feet above the ground, a crosswind caught the aircraft and pushed it toward the rocky outcropping on the right side of the landing zone. Rachel corrected with a combination of rudder input and throttle adjustment that she'd practiced 1,000 times in simulators, but had never needed to use in actual flight. The F-14 touched down hard, its landing gear absorbing the impact of the rough terrain. Rachel immediately applied brakes and reverse thrust, bringing the aircraft to a stop just short of the boulder field at the far end of the strip. As the engines wound down, she could hear voices shouting outside the cockpit. The rescue team was already running toward the aircraft, carrying what looked like an improvised stretcher. Rachel popped the canopy and climbed out, her legs shaky from the adrenaline of the landing. The first person to reach her was Dr. Amanda Foster, the research team leader. "Thank God you made it," Foster said, her voice cracking with relief. "We weren't sure anyone would be able to reach us." "What's the medical situation?" Rachel asked, immediately focusing on the mission. "David Martinez, no relation, I assume?" "Has a broken leg and possible internal injuries. Lisa Chen has a concussion and a fractured wrist. I've got cuts and bruises, but I'm mobile. Rachel opened the rear compartment and began unloading the medical supplies that Dr. Clark had prepared. Let's get your people stabilized and loaded. We need to be airborne in 30 minutes. The next 25 minutes were the most intense of Rachel's military career. Working with Dr. Foster, she helped stabilize the injured researchers and prepare them for transport. The F-14's rear compartment had been modified to accommodate one stretcher patient, while the second injured person would occupy the radar intercept officer's seat. "This is going to be a rough ride," Rachel warned as they loaded David Martinez into the stretcher position. The aircraft wasn't designed for medical transport. "Rougher than dying in these mountains," Martinez replied weakly. "I'll take my chances with the pilot, who was crazy enough to land here." As they completed the loading process, Rachel noticed something that made her pause. The weather was changing. Clouds were building over the mountain passes, and the wind was shifting to a more dangerous direction. She checked her watch. The weather window was closing faster than predicted. "Everyone secure?" she called back to her passengers. "As secure as we can be," Dr. Foster replied from the RIO seat. "Let's get out of here." Rachel strapped herself in and began the engine startup sequence. The F-14 roared to life again, its twin engines echoing off the mountain walls like the sound of defiance itself. The takeoff was even more challenging than the landing. With the added weight of passengers and medical equipment, the aircraft required more runway distance. Rachel pushed the throttles to maximum power and held them there as the Tomcat accelerated toward the boulder field at the end of the strip. At the last possible moment, she pulled back on the stick, and the F-14 lifted off with barely 20 feet to spare. She felt the aircraft settle into climb attitude and knew they were going to make it. "How's everyone doing back there?" she called over the engine noise. "Still alive," came the response from Dr. Foster. "Martinez is stable. Chen is conscious. You're officially a miracle worker." Rachel smiled grimly as she banked the aircraft toward home. The hardest part was over, but they still had to navigate through mountain passes that were rapidly filling with weather. As she flew the F-14 through the narrow valleys, fighting crosswinds and turbulence that would have challenged any pilot in any aircraft, Rachel realized something that surprised her. She wasn't thinking about vindication or proving points or settling scores with the people who'd grounded her. She was just flying, and for the first time in 3 years, that was enough. The radio crackled to life as they cleared the final mountain pass. Phoenix, this is Tower. Do you copy? Tower, this is Phoenix. I'm inbound with 3 passengers, 1 critical, ETA 15 minutes. Request medical team standing by. Phoenix, medical team is ready. Outstanding work. Welcome home." As the base appeared on the horizon, Rachel could see emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, their lights flashing in the morning sun. The entire base had turned out to watch the return of the aircraft that everyone had written off and the pilot that everyone had forgotten. But as Rachel lined up for final approach, she wasn't thinking about the crowd waiting for her. She was thinking about 3 people who were going home alive because someone had remembered that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Phoenix was coming home, and she was bringing everyone with her. The runway at Nellis Air Force Base had never looked more beautiful. Rachel lined up the F-14 for final approach, her hands steady on the controls despite the exhaustion that was beginning to creep through her body. Behind her, Dr. Foster was monitoring the injured researchers, providing updates on their condition that confirmed they'd made the right choice in attempting the rescue. "Phoenix, you are cleared for landing. Emergency crews are standing by," came the voice from the tower. "Copy that, Tower. Phoenix is on final approach." As the F-14 descended toward the runway, Rachel could see the crowd that had gathered to watch their return. Ground crews, maintenance personnel, pilots, and officers stood along the flight line, creating an impromptu reception that she'd never expected. Even from the cockpit, she could feel the energy of people who understood that they were witnessing something significant. The landing was textbook perfect. The F-14's main gear touched down smoothly, followed by the nose gear, and Rachel deployed the drag chute to bring the aircraft to a controlled stop. As the engines wound down for the final time, she felt a sense of completion that went beyond the successful mission. Before the canopy was fully open, Medical teams were already positioning themselves around the aircraft. Dr. Clark led the emergency response, coordinating the careful extraction of the injured researchers with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for exactly this scenario. Rachel climbed out of the cockpit and immediately began helping with the medical evacuation. David Martinez was transferred from the improvised stretcher to a proper medical gurney, while Lisa Chen was able to walk to the ambulance with assistance. Dr. Foster emerged from the REO seat looking shaken, but grateful. 6 months later, Captain Rachel Martinez stood in front of a classroom filled with the Air Force's most promising young pilots. The room was in the newly established Analog Flight Systems Training Center, a program that had grown from a single rescued F-14 into a comprehensive curriculum designed to ensure that future aviators understood both cutting-edge technology and time-tested fundamentals. "Who can tell me the primary weakness of computer-dependent navigation systems?" Rachel asked the class. Lieutenant Jennifer Adams raised her hand. "They're vulnerable to electromagnetic interference, system failures, and cyber attacks." "Correct. And what's the solution?" "Backup analog systems and manual navigation skills," Adams replied. "Exactly." Rachel moved to the whiteboard where she'd drawn a diagram of dead reckoning navigation. 3 years ago, I submitted a report about these vulnerabilities. The report was dismissed because the prevailing wisdom was that our technology was too advanced to fail. She paused, looking at the faces of pilots who'd grown up with GPS, digital displays, and computer-assisted everything. "How many of you have ever navigated by paper map and compass?" Only 3 hands went up out of 20 students. "That's exactly why this program exists," Rachel continued. "Not because analog systems are better than digital ones, but because a complete pilot understands both. When your computers fail, not if, but when, you need to be able to continue the mission using basic principles that haven't changed since the Wright brothers." After class, Rachel walked across the base to her new office in the Flight Operations Building. The nameplate on her door read, "Captain Rachel Martinez, Director, Analog Flight Systems Program." It was a title that would have seemed like a contradiction 6 months ago. Now it represented the Air Force's acknowledgement that traditional skills were just as important as technological innovation. Her desk held a stack of mission reports from pilots who'd completed the analog training program. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Aviators who'd initially resented being forced to learn obsolete skills were discovering that the training made them better pilots overall. A knock on her door interrupted her reading. "Come in." Major Stevens entered, carrying a folder and wearing the expression of someone with interesting news. "Rachel, I've got an update on the research team you rescued." "How are they doing?" "David Martinez made a full recovery. He's back in the field. Lisa Chen had some lingering effects from the concussion, but she's cleared for duty. Dr. Foster specifically asked me to give you this." Stevens handed Rachel a letter with her name written in careful script. Inside was a photograph of the research team standing beside a newly installed seismic monitoring station in the mountains. The note read, "Captain Martinez. The data we collected from that expedition led to an early warning system that's already prevented 3 major landslides. Your rescue mission saved more than just our lives. It protected an entire valley. Community, we named the monitoring station Phoenix Point in your honor. Thank you for proving that heroes still exist. Dr. Amanda Foster." Rachel felt her throat tighten slightly. She'd known the rescue was important, but she hadn't realized the broader impact of the research they'd saved. "There's more," Stevens continued. "The F-14 rescue mission has become something of a legend in military aviation circles. The Air Force Museum wants to acquire the aircraft for a permanent display, but there's a catch. They want you to fly it there personally." The idea of her old Tomcat sitting in a museum felt strange, but Rachel understood the symbolism. The aircraft had served its purpose, proving that reliable mechanical systems and skilled pilots could succeed when advanced technology failed. "I think I'd like that," she said finally. Later that evening, Rachel walked through Hangar Bay 3-1. Final time before the F-14 was transferred to the museum. The space looked different now. It was filled with a mix of modern aircraft and carefully maintained older systems that were being used for training purposes. The Tomcat sat in the center of the hangar, polished and prepared for its final flight. Maintenance crews had restored it to museum-quality condition while preserving the character marks that told the story of its rescue mission. Sergeant Brooks, now Master Sergeant Brooks after his own promotion, approached from the maintenance area. "She looks good, doesn't she?" "She looks perfect," Rachel replied, "ready for her final mission." "You know," Brooks said thoughtfully, "when we were working on this bird 3 years ago, I never imagined it would end up in the Air Force Museum with a plaque describing the rescue mission." Rachel smiled. "I never imagined I'd end up training the next generation of pilots to do things the old way." "Maybe that's the point," Brooks suggested. "The best missions are the ones you never see coming." As they stood beside the aircraft, other personnel began gathering in the hangar. Word had spread that Captain Martinez was making her final flight in the F-14, and people wanted to witness the end of a story that had become part of base legend. Commander Harrison, now Colonel Harrison after his own promotion, stepped forward. "Captain Martinez, on behalf of Nellis Air Force Base, I want to thank you for reminding us that the most important technology we have is the knowledge and skill of our people." The speech was brief but heartfelt. When it concluded, Rachel climbed into the F-14's cockpit one last time. The familiar controls felt like old friends. Analog instruments that had never failed her, mechanical systems that had proven their reliability when everything else went dark. As the engines spooled up and the Tomcat began its taxi toward the runway, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years of inventory sheets and maintenance logs had led to a rescue mission that changed her career and influenced Air Force training doctrine. "Tower, this is Phoenix requesting clearance for final departure. Phoenix, this is Tower. You are cleared for takeoff. It's been an honor." The F-14 lifted off from Nellis Air Force Base and climbed toward the museum that would be its final destination. But as Rachel flew through the clear Nevada sky, she realized that this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. Somewhere below, young pilots were learning that the most advanced technology was the wisdom to understand when simple solutions worked best. They were discovering that backup systems weren't signs of weakness, but evidence of thoroughness. They were developing the skills that would serve them when their computers failed and their satellites went dark. Rachel Martinez had spent 3 years being overlooked and underestimated, but she'd never stopped preparing, never stopped learning, never stopped believing that her skills would matter when it counted. And when the moment came, she was ready. The F-14 Tomcat flew toward its place in history, carrying with it the proof that sometimes the most important victories come not from the latest technology, but from the oldest virtues: competence, preparation, and the quiet courage to act when others cannot. Phoenix had risen from the ashes of a grounded career to become something more important than a decorated pilot. She'd become a teacher, a reminder, and a symbol of the truth that in aviation, as in life, the fundamentals never go out of style. As the museum airfield appeared on the horizon, Rachel smiled. Her final flight in the F-14 was ending, but her real mission was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Ground support logistics, then the cockpit. Rachel paused beside a row of F-35 Lightning IIs, their sleek frames gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. These were the jets she used to fly, back when her call sign, Phoenix, was painted on locker doors and mission boards. Now the only thing painted anywhere was Inventory Queen, scrawled in grease pencil on her storage locker by someone who thought they were being clever. She didn't mind the nickname anymore. What stung was watching younger pilots, fresh from flight school, climb into cockpits she'd been flying since they were in high school. What really burned was knowing that her technical expertise, the reason she'd been grounded, was exactly what this base needed. 3 years ago, she'd submitted a report about a critical flaw in the new flight control systems. The override protocols had a 2-second delay that could be fatal in combat situations. She'd tested it herself during a training exercise, nearly losing control of her aircraft when the computer failed to respond to her commands. Instead of investigating her findings, Commander Harrison called her insubordinate and a threat to unit cohesion. Technical concerns should flow through proper channels, he'd said during that sterile meeting in his office, not through dramatic displays that undermine confidence in our equipment. The irony wasn't lost on her now, as she watched maintenance crews scrambling around the newer jets, muttering about system failures and digital glitches. The same systems she'd warned them about. Rachel moved deeper into the hangar, past rows of sophisticated aircraft that relied entirely on computer networks and satellite connections. In the far corner, covered in dust and forgotten by everyone else, sat something different. An F-14 Tomcat, probably older than half the crew on base. The Navy had retired these birds years ago, but this one had somehow ended up here, tucked away like an embarrassing relative at a family reunion. She ran her hand along the aircraft's wing, feeling the solid metal beneath layers of grime. No fancy computers, no satellite uplinks, no digital dependencies. Just pure mechanical engineering and pilot skill. The kind of flying she'd learned from her father, a Vietnam veteran who used to say, "Rachel, machines will fail you, but physics never lies." Still playing with the museum piece, Martinez. The voice belonged to Captain Derek Thompson, one of Harrison's golden boys. He stood near the entrance with two other pilots, all of them wearing the kind of smug expressions that made Rachel's jaw tighten. "Just doing my job," she replied, not looking up from her clipboard. "Right, your job." Thompson's laugh was sharp. "Must be nice having such simple responsibilities. No pressure, no real decisions to make." Rachel's pen stopped moving. She looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with the steady composure that had gotten her through flight school, through combat missions, and through 3 years of being treated like furniture. "Someone has to make sure you boys have working equipment," she said quietly. "Wouldn't want you to have to think too hard up there." Thompson's smile faltered. Before he could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the hangar. Red lights flashed from the ceiling as personnel rushed toward emergency stations. Through the massive hangar doors, Rachel could see smoke rising from somewhere beyond the flight line. "All personnel to emergency stations," crackled a voice over the intercom. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." As chaos erupted around her, Rachel found herself standing alone beside the old Tomcat. While others ran toward the crisis, she remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the aircraft that everyone else had forgotten. In the distance, she could hear Commander Harrison's voice barking orders, coordinating responses, taking charge of a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond anyone's control. But his voice seemed to fade as Rachel's attention focused on something else entirely. The sound of her own heartbeat, steady and determined, echoing in the sudden silence around the forgotten jet. Something was coming. Something that would require more than fancy computers and satellite links. Something that would need a pilot who understood that sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked. Rachel Martinez had been waiting 3 years for this moment. She just hadn't known it yet. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.